Welcome everybody to our Space Internet Governance webinar. I'm Scott Burleigh, I work at JPL, and I'm Vice Chair of the Interplanetary Networking Special Interest Group of the Internet Society, and I will not be talking much at all. Our panelists will be talking. We have two prominent experts in this area. First will be Dr. Scott Pace, who's the Deputy Assistant to the President and the Executive Secretary of the National Space Council. His bio is on the website, and it's lengthy and impressive, including receiving the NASA Outstanding Leadership Medal in 2008, and the NASA Columbia Accident Rapid Response Team Group Achievement Award from 2004 for the Columbia work. After Dr. Pace speaks, we'll have some time for question and answer. And then our second panelist will be Dr. Vinton Cerf, who is Vice President and Chief Internet Evangelist for Google, and one of the original designers of the internet that we know and love and are using at this very moment. The topic of today's panel discussion will be governance of a space internet. That is, as we acquire the ability to extend the capabilities of the internet into interplanetary space, how would we govern that institution in ways that maybe are analogous to the problem of governing the internet on Earth? And so the kinds of questions we expect to explore a little bit in this panel discussion would be, do we need a governance model for the internet in space? If we do, what would the framework for it be? Who are the stakeholders? Who should be providing input to them? What kind of enforcement would make sense in that environment? And are there existing organizations or models that would be useful in forming that framework for guidance and enforcement of the government's policies? So with that as background, I would propose to turn it over to Dr. Scott Pace for his remarks. Dr. Pace.
Super, thank you, Scott. So I probably, as a preface, put in, like, how did I wind up in this job? I started off as a technician at JPL when $2.85 an hour was good, and it came with overtime. I had when I worked at NASA, I told them that one of my experiences in the 70s was having my overtime hours cut to pay for shuttle cost overruns. Not that I was bitter about it years later or anything. I think some people were wondering if I was kidding or not. The point is I started off on the technical side, but later, as I worked in industry, I got more involved in sort of like marketing and business development side, and where it was clear that policy issues were a much bigger driver than maybe one might have been taught in engineering school. And so that motivated me to go back and get a doctorate in public policy at the RAND Corporation, which is one of the foundations of modern public policy analysis. From there, I wind up in government, and again, all this is in the bio, but where I wind up working at that interface between the private sector and the public sector on many space issues. So many space technologies, including the internet, are dual use. So there are competing forces on how we should govern those dual use technologies, whether it's launch, remote sensing, internet, anything else. And so public policy plays a big role in that. and then went on to do a whole bunch of other jobs, which was again there in the bios, went into university, came back for this administration, working at the Space Council. So part of my motivation to talk to the group here today is that you guys are at the cutting edge of creating a space internet and raising these questions about governance, because you probably suspect there might be some system constraints or some different incentives that would drive your design other than maybe the purely technical ones. And so hopefully that's what we'll have discussions about. Scott or Mike, did people have access to the briefing that I sent out? Update on national space policy, is that available?
Yes.
Okay, well, super. Let's go to the next slide on briefing overview. And this one shows the Vice President, who's my boss, in front of a space shuttle and at a National Space Council meeting. And so what I want to talk about very briefly in this, so we save time for conversation, is U.S. national space policy, and then what our priorities are on the civil, commercial, and national security sectors, which are the three traditional sectors that make up space policy. So next chart should be titled the National Space Council. So the National Space Council is a policy council within the White House, and it's similar and different, I'll get to in a moment, to other policy councils. So the National Security Council is a policy council, Domestic Policy Council, National Economic Council are policy councils. And what policy councils are is that they are meeting points for the agencies. And the agencies in turn represent various national interests. So when you write policy, it's not a matter of sitting down with a legal pad and just writing deathless prose on it. It's a matter of adjudicating and combining and blending multiple different, sometimes competing and conflicting national interests. And the way you do that is you have representatives come from the agencies who represent those interests. So Commerce Department, State Department, Defense, NASA, Energy. And while they're all very smart and capable people by themselves, the reason they're there is to represent their agency's interests, which in turn represent an aspect of national interest. So you might think of, we incarnate in human beings those interests and have them then come together to discuss and conflict. It's a bit of a body contact sport. Now, each of those councils is generally headed by an assistant to the president. That is somebody who directly works for the president, is commissioned by him. So the assistant to the president for national security affairs is the national security advisor, is one who heads and is sort of the executive secretary for the National Security Council, which is chaired by the president. In the case of the Space Council, the vice president is the chair, and I'm his executive secretary for it. The list of members of the Space Council are there on the left of the chart, basically all cabinet offices, a couple of direct assistants to the president, director of OMB, NASA administrator, as you all might expect. Now, the job of the Space Council is this coordinating of space policy, not just in the civil side, not just NASA, but across all the sectors. That means commercial and national security. The Space Council was most recently very active during the Bush 41 administration, 1989 to 92. When I was at the Commerce Department, I was the rep from Commerce, representing commercial interests, to the Space Council at that time, and Vice President Dan Quayle was the head of it. It then really became dormant for the next 25 years. Every president basically decides how they want to organize the White House themselves. They'll have different styles and different priorities. So there's nothing that says you have to have a Space Council. You have it if the president wants it. And so through the Clinton administration and Bush administration, space issues were generally handled by one person on the National Security Council staff and one person in the Office of Science and Technology Policy. Given the workload that space stuff tended to generate, you probably should have had maybe 4 to 5 people rather than 2 doing that job. The Space Council today is basically 8 people. I've got detailees from other agencies, so I'm probably at a pretty good size. I don't really want to grow more. If we had less, it'd be a bit of a stretch. So I think we're at a good size. In comparison, the National Security Council is maybe 120, 130 people. At one time during the last administration, it was 200, which most people thought was too large. So 100, 120 for the National Security Council. We're like 8. There was a National Space Council of sorts under the Eisenhower administration, but it really wasn't well known. In the 1960 election between Nixon and Kennedy, Kennedy made a thing of what he thought was a missile gap, that the Soviets were pulling ahead of us in missiles. There really wasn't the kind of intelligence available to show that that wasn't the case, but nonetheless, it was a political issue in the 1960 campaign. As part of that fear of the Soviets pulling way ahead in missiles, Kennedy said that he would strengthen the Space Council and he would make the vice president the chair of it. So Lyndon Johnson was the first vice president to chair a Space Council, and that tradition has occurred since. When there is a Space Council, the vice president is the person. So we then became reinvigorated and active in this administration, starting in June of 2017, and with a new executive order signed, reinvigorating and establishing the council. So that's sort of our bureaucratics. Next chart shows a user advisory group, and what this is an advisory group to the National Space Council. So there's things like the NASA Advisory Council, which is the federal advisory committee that advises NASA. Other agencies all have advisory council groups of outside people who come together to give advice to the government. Well, this is ours, and there's about 30 people on it, 28 to 30 people, and it's run under the Federal Advisory Committee Acts. There's a bunch of subcommittees on various topics. You can see down there to the right. Again, to span the range of things that we do in the council, so the subcommittee kind of matches many of our topic areas. And what the subcommittees will go off and meet, they'll get various tasks from the vice president or me sometimes, and they then kind of report back. A condition here is that their recommendations, as formal recommendations from the group, have to be done in a public hearing. That has to be notified in the Federal Register, and we web stream it. So while the subcommittees can kind of go off and work by themselves, anything that comes to us from the advisory group has to be done through a public meeting. That's how recommendations are adopted. It's part of a sort of a sunshine in government, a transparency requirement that goes back to the Federal Advisory Committee Act of 1972. The people on the committee are pretty high level. They're things like the CEOs for Lockheed and Boeing, former astronauts like Eileen Collins and Pam Melroy. We have people who represent trade associations like Commercial Spaceflight Federation, and again, other former astronauts like Jack Schmitt, Apollo 17. The chairman is Admiral Jim Ellis, who used to be head of Stratcom and has a long history in space areas. And so he's the person that I work with probably the most. Next chart talks about National Space Council staff. As again, we mentioned, have about 8 people on board. What the council does, there's lots of nice words about, removing barriers and helping, strengthen the U.S. space enterprise. But what it comes down to are 2 types of activities. One is pressing downward on the agencies to drive the implementation of administration space priorities. So if we say something like, we want to streamline regulation, or we want to, strengthen our military capabilities in space, or we want to have international discussions on cooperation on returning to the moon. Those priorities are pressed down to the agencies, and we basically make sure, are you doing what we asked you to do? The other is to adjudicate issues that come up. So agencies, in the course of trying to do what we ask them, will sometimes have conflicts. So there are, again, competing national interests. So commerce and state, or defense and state, or NASA and commerce, will have some issue between them, try to resolve it between themselves, but if they don't, then we become an adjudication function where they come to meetings and we elevate, and if we can't solve it at a staff level, we go to deputies level, which means things like the Deputy Secretary of State or the Deputy Administrator for NASA. If that doesn't work, we go to principals, which are the heads of the agencies. And if that doesn't work, we have an issue paper for the president, and he has to decide. And generally, it better be something really important to get to the president, because if not, it means that, why does he bother having all these other people working for him if they can't work these issues out? But every once in a while, there'll be something that'll be fairly fundamental, and it does have to go to the president for a decision. So the policy process, which is the next chart, we don't do implementation. We don't push buttons, launch rockets, build equipment, or anything like that. That is done by the agencies and the contractors. Our job in the policy side is to make sure that the tasks being done and the reasons they're being done and the resources that are being done are all aligned correctly. That we often talk about the difference between policy programs and budgets. If ever you want to look for where there's going to be friction in the policymaking process or in government generally, you'll see it at the interface between those three areas. That is, a disconnect between, say, the policy and what the programs are done being constructed to do that policy, or you'll see a disconnect between the programs that have been given certain responsibility versus the budgets that they've been aligned. So misalignment in those areas is classically, misalignment of those interfaces is classically where we would get involved, say, in resolving interagency conflict. The process, as I said, is this escalatory ladder. If we're not solving an immediate problem, say we want to start a new policy review, like we want to review and update GPS policy or national space policy or cyber issues, all of which we're engaged on. The first thing is to have a policy review decision. That is, the decision to even work on a topic is itself a political choice. And so you have to decide, do we want to work on this or do we want to work on something else? And that's number one. Then we form interagency working groups that represent all the affected interests. They resolve issues. If they don't, they escalate. As we resolve those issues, then we eventually have a document, a policy document that is ready to go to the White House staff secretary. They follow all the paper flow inside the White House. They check back with everyone to say, all right, does everybody agree upon this? Any more changes, any more text? They're the final sort of independent gatekeeper. They will share text with legislative counsel over at the Justice Department, which reviews everything the president signs. And once it clears, the lawyers and the agencies and everybody's going, got it, we're all on board, then it goes to the president for signature. And that's how we got our space policy directives, which we'll talk about on the next chart. So U.S. national space policy, one of the fundamental choices you can make coming in to a new administration on space is, do you start with a review of national policy, or do you wind up working on particular problems and then do national space policy later as a result? So for example, in the Bush administration, Bush 43, they largely worked off of the 1996 Clinton policy, did a bunch of particular sectoral policies dealing with space transportation and remote sensing and GPS. And then in the second term, rolled up a national space policy in 2006. When the Obama administration came in, they right off the bat did a review of space policy, one of the very first things they did, because they wanted to change the Bush policy. And so the 2010 Obama policy was created. Presidential policies exist up until the time another president changes them. So policies don't go away when a new administration comes in. There are policies on international space cooperation, for example, that go back to Nixon. We did an update on the authorization process for launching nuclear material. and we wound up updating a document that had been done in 1977 in the Carter administration that had been signed off by the National Security Advisors, Zbigniew Brzezinski, back then. So policies continue until they're changed. The president can change them, but it takes that level of action. It can't be changed by people below the presidential level. In coming in, we looked at the Obama policy, and basically most of it's fine. There were a couple sections of it, though, that we thought were kind of poor, to be frank. And so we focused on them first, while leaving the bulk of the policy alone. The one that was probably the most burning issue was human space exploration. The Obama administration had a concept for a journey to Mars, which, while wonderful and visionary, wasn't really working from a practical standpoint. Didn't really have an executable plan, didn't have commercial partners, didn't have international partners, because that step was so large. Now, my perception of it and others was that this was actually doing us harm, because we were not attracting other people to work with us. And as a result, other countries were going their own separate way, having their own programs, because they didn't really see a way they could participate in the effort. And so space programs like exploration don't exist merely to do cool things. They exist to meet larger national interests. One of the characteristics of the current environment, as different than, say, the 1960s, is that space is much more globalized, it's much more democratized in terms of more private companies participate, countries participate. So we needed to have a space exploration program that would actually pull people toward us and take advantage of these different conditions. So that's what Space Policy Directive 1 was about, and that's where the Moon to Mars direction came from. We also recognize that we aren't going to be dropping 1% of the GDP onto space activities, as did occur in fiscal year 64 during the Apollo program. So we needed to grow the economy, and we need to make sure the commercial sector does well. So that meant Space Policy Directive 2, which is streamlining regulation, updating regulation, dealing with commercial space. So export controls, remote sensing, launch, those were all activities. We've concluded the update on remote sensing. Export controls are being updated regularly. The next really big one is on space launch, because the older regulations didn't envision things like reusable rockets and the high frequency of launch rates that we're dealing with today. So that review process under the FAA is still ongoing. With the numbers of launches and with the mega constellations potentially going up, we came in and said, well, we need to be able to manage all this traffic. And there had not been, lots of debate, but there had not been a national policy and direction on roles and responsibilities for space traffic management, who should do what, and what does the DoD do, what does the civil side do. So that's what Space Policy Directive 3 became in order to respond to the changing conditions. And then finally, the 4 dealt with the creation of a United States Space Force. The previous administration didn't really actually suppress talk of space as a warfighting domain, despite Russian and Chinese anti-satellite advances. And so while space conflict was discussed among professional military people, it wasn't part of doctrine, it wasn't part of public posture. And we concluded that that was kind of a denial of the reality we were in, and that the president decided that we should create a U.S. Space Force. This idea didn't come out of nowhere. It turns out a Space Force was one of several options that had been looked at on military space reform for a long time. There were other models, something like Special Operations Command. There were things to do within the Air Force. And Space Force was one of about 4 different major options. President picked number 4 and said that's the one that he wanted to proceed with. And we did that. Now, the president alone cannot create a Space Force. This requires Congress, because we have to amend Title 10 of U.S. Code that deals with the armed services. That happened, and the president was able to sign Space Force into law in December of 2019. So the policy directive here was to the direction for creating a legislative proposal. This is what we want the legislation to look like. This is what we want to have accomplish. And that became the basis for the administration's legislative proposal. Congress worked with it, didn't give us everything, gave us some other things that were good, but it was, again, part of a back and forth with the Congress that resulted in the Space Force that we're now implementing today. A couple of other smaller items. I mentioned the space nuclear approval process that we updated to deal with new safety standards that we've learned since the 1970s. We did an executive order on strengthening the resilience of critical infrastructure through position navigation timing services, mostly GPS, but other systems. Again, recognizing the heavy dependency that critical infrastructure now has on those space systems. And then finally, an executive order on support for the recovery and use of space resources. If we're going to be exploring in a more sustainable manner for SPD-1, we can't be hauling everything up from Earth. We need to use local in situ resources like lunar water ice, and having a stable international regime that recognizes that ability to use non-terrestrial resources and particularly use them by the private sector was something we needed to get international engagement on. And so the executive order here dealt with that, and it's part of the Artemis Accords, which are the cooperating agreements, policy cooperating agreements that NASA and State Department discuss with other countries who want to be part of this U.S. return to the moon. The next chart deals with space exploration priorities. Again, kind of repeat some of the stuff that I already said about SPD-1. SPD-1 did not specify particular dates in it, but the Vice President, at the direction of the President in March of 2019, went and said we need to move the date up, that the original date for a lunar landing was 2028. He wanted to know what was the earliest possible date that could plausibly be done, 2024. That becomes the target. So as a result of that, a number of procurement items moved a lot faster than I think they would have normally. And one of the major ones is the human landing system. So for the first time since Apollo, we have major contracts underway with 3 teams building human landing systems, a SpaceX, a Blue Origin-led team, and a Dynetics team. So we, of course, are asking for additional funds to support and keep to that schedule. Congress to date is not happy with us on that, and they're pushing back, so they're giving us some of the money and not all of it. That means that date, would slip if we don't get that money. But we're putting forward a plan that says this is the earliest we can do this, and we're looking to work with Congress to try to hit those targets. But as I said, we got 3 contracts awarded, people are working, designs are happening, again, for the first time since Apollo. So the next chart, dealing with other space exploration updates. Of course, you're all familiar with the Doug and Bob on the Dragon Mission 2 going up and safely returning. There on the chart, you'll see the 3 teams that I mentioned. Next chart on international cooperation. The picture there is one of Reagan at the 1984 G7 summit for the space station model. And you'll see people like Margaret Thatcher in there, Prime Minister Nakasone of Japan. This was an effort to bring international partners onto the space station program from the beginning. So the Apollo program was essentially a US-only operation. The shuttle was mostly US with a Canadian arm, and then later a European space lab, but Japan was not a participant in it. Space station wound up bringing not only the Europeans on board, but Japan on board, and then later in the Clinton administration, bringing the Russians on board. So it became a much more of an international exercise than anything we had done previously. And the same is going to be true of returning to the moon. That it's going to be very much an international effort. It's not going to be a singular, U.S. race to the moon. The phrase, second bullet there, America first, does not mean America alone. That was from General McMaster, the National Security Advisor, when I first got here. Vice President has said the same thing. We need and want other countries to be involved with us. But in addition to the technical work, we also want them to share similar values. So rule of law, economic systems, human rights. There's a lot of things which are, if you will, soft topics that are not purely technical issues, but that represent the kind of values we seek in cooperating together. Part of the reason that we invited the Russians to participate in the space station in the 90s was we saw Russia moving toward democracy, moving toward a more liberalized economy. So as part of symbolizing a post-Soviet relationship with Russia was part of what the space station was about. Frankly speaking, if the diplomatic conditions today existed back then, we would not have done that. So far, we've been good at keeping space cooperation isolated from other geopolitical stresses. The Russians are terrific to work with. After the shuttle accident, we would not have been able to maintain maintain the station without the Russians. They've been our ride to space on Soyuz for 9 years, much longer than we had wanted. So at the technical level, we have a lot of respect for them. They work together well, but of course, the broader relationship is much tougher. It's, in some cases, it's probably the only positive thing as part of the relationship. Next chart. Dealing with commercial space priorities. Again, you just have to open up any news blog and you'll see more commercial stuff going on. The regulatory reforms that we've been doing are simply trying to keep up with the speed of the market and technology, because we know companies have the option to pretty much go anywhere in the world. And we want the U.S. to be the flag of choice. We want companies to operate here and bring them back. One of the areas that's still an open topic for me, because it's not really under control of the administration, is satellite communications. The FCC is a regulator for satellite systems. And since the early 2000s, FCC regulatory changes in user fees have largely incentivized many companies, not all, but many U.S. companies to go overseas. UK, Norway, Netherlands, Luxembourg. So we'd like more of those to come back, but that's not under our control. Again, the FCC is an independent regulatory body. So we're working on the things we can affect, like launch and remote sensing and export controls. And we're in dialogue with the FCC on what they're doing to regulate space. They've got rulemakings going forward on orbital debris, for example, as well as licensing new mega constellations. And we make progress in some areas. We don't make progress as fast as in other areas, but that's the nature of dealing with an independent regulator. Next chart, dealing with national security. What the chart there sort of shows that we overlap, many of our topics overlap with our colleagues on the National Security Council. And we all work for the same boss. We all work for the president, but we report up through different channels. So I report up through, Space Council reports up to the Vice President, which then goes to the President. The National Security Council reports up to the National Security Advisor, who also reports to the President. So we have different reporting chains that we work out. We don't have a formal charter between us. What we generally work out on a case-by-case basis, and which has been working pretty well, is that if something is purely military, like general officer promotions or delegation of authorities within a command, hey, that's National Security Council, they go do that. If something overlaps both civil and military, then we'll do a joint event. So we've had several interagency working groups that are joint and co-chair them. And in some cases, which are, say, purely civil, like some of the exploration activities, NSC will sit in and track, but won't really run it, but they'll be definitely part of the discussions. We each have different processes for getting decisions to the President. Frankly, my NSC colleagues suffer with a probably more difficult and bureaucratic process. Mine's a little bit more streamlined to work with. Goes through all the same checks, but I think it's a little bit easier. So sometimes something that might go up through the Security Council we'll wind up doing. One, because we have a lot of equities, and two, maybe we can move it more easily. The example, the executive order on resilience for position, navigation, timing issues was something that we decided to take on as having a big civil and commercial impact. We could probably do the process a little easier. Moving to the next chart, talking about national security, space priorities. Something begun in the last administration was try to make our space architectures more resilient. There's a lot of bad stuff going out there, jamming, laser dazzling, anti-satellite weapons, space-based, ground-based. It's not a sanctuary environment the way it might have been temporarily in the past. So we need to be able to deter potential adversaries from thinking that there's a cheap or an easy kill. And we need to develop countermeasures, both on defensive and offensive ways, to make sure that we can deliver the space services that our forces depend on. We're more space reliant than really any other military service. And we try to, as with other military activities, in addition to the force structure itself, we have a variety of bilateral, multilateral engagements. We try to make sure that people are sharing burdens in some equitable manner. We try to coordinate on responses. And so NATO has declared space to be an operational domain. They didn't use the word warfighting, they call it an operational domain. And the various combatant commands around the world, European Command, Indo-PACOM, they all recognize the importance of national security capabilities, the changing threat environment. So we work with DoD and the intelligence community on that. The next chart talks about national security space sort of update. In addition to the establishment of the Space Force, which is the big news, we've also, space is recognized as the geographic combatant command. So there's a U.S. Space Command that begins 100 miles up. And just like other regional combatant commands that deal with, the Middle East or the Pacific or Europe, space is its own regional combatant command. Let's see, next chart. Last one, of course, U.S. Space Force. Actually, before this call, I just got off my weekly call on updating on U.S. Space Force. Something in maybe the less serious category, but still cool. It turns out the U.S. Space Force, believe it or not, is going to have a car in the Indy 500 race on August 23rd. And there was even an ad on Facebook. So this is what the guys do for recruiting, I guess, and public affairs. Other services do it. And it had cars in the Indy 500 race, so there was going to be a Space Force car. So if you look up Space Force on Facebook or whatever, you'll see the car out there. So recruiting has not been a problem. We have had really a great response of folks in the services wanting to join. So in fact, we've been able to really be very selective in picking who we take into what is still going to be a very, very small service. And we've had the first cadets graduate from the Air Force Academy and commission directly into the Space Force. ROTC commissionings, officer training school commissionings are also in work. So it's standing up and becoming, again, a regular service. With that, going on a bit long, so let me pause right there and take questions, maybe starting with Scott or Vint, and then really leave it to you to moderate and ask me anything you want.
Well, thank you very, very much, Scott. That's quite a comprehensive review. I didn't realize you were going to be able to cover so much territory in such a quick time. So thank you for that. I suspect that there are questions from the listeners. We have a Q&A component here. Let me see if there's anything there. Nope, not at the moment. So I have a bunch of questions, though, if it's okay to start with. One of them has to do with the protection of GPS. I know that there has been a lot of up and down and sideways with regard to frequency allocation and the GPS system. But more generally, one of the issues that arises is the ease with which the signal can be jammed because it's such a weak signal by the time you get back down onto the surface of the Earth. So what's the general sense right now about any strengthening either of the GPS system itself, maybe with new kinds of frequency modulation? I realize we don't want to get into anything classified. Or alternatively, are there additional positioning, timing, and location capabilities? I remember LORAN-C, for example, popped up on the horizon at one point. So what's the thinking about that? Sure.
Basically, in all of the above strategy, in the resilient, in the EO on executive order on resilient systems, we talk about having multiple diverse systems. There is no single magic bullet. I mean, sometimes I think our friends who are fans of ELORAN, which is a wonderful solution, treat it as kind of like the only solution. And we see it really as one. There are multiple different companies who have different ways of providing non-space-based services. So in the case of most GPS systems, they're augmented in some way. That is, it's not just purely a GPS signal, but you're picking up Wi-Fi and cell towers. You have small inertial systems that provide information. There's mapping. So, you know, the GPS in one's cell phone is often an augmented system with multiple things going on rather than just, you know, GPS standalone. Same thing with resilience. You're going to have multiple overlapping systems that give you the performance that you want. So GPS is going to be the core system. It's going to be, we're going to be relying on it because it's there, it's cheap, it's very cost effective, but we're going to basically be augmenting it. So we're doing things, we have ability to flex power on the satellites. So if there's jamming in a particular area, we can adjust and shift a little bit in a combat environment. We have military receivers that can operate under jamming conditions pretty well, but those things are very expensive. That isn't really a consumer solution. So military solutions are actually pretty good in the sense of, yes, it can be jammed, but we have a lot of workarounds for that, both of the receivers, spacecraft, as well as other systems. For the consumer, the reliance of multiple networks on GPS has meant that we need to improve the resilience there, and providing solutions that are low cost enough to be able to be put into consumer platforms, you know, is really the challenge. DARPA and others have all kinds of like fun technologies, you know, micromechanical systems and laser ring gyros and so forth. Not a lot of them are really applicable into the consumer market. So things like, you know, ELRAN or other broadcast systems or piggybacking on TV signals show, I think, a little bit more promise. But no single magic bullet. It's going to be multiple layers of overlapping ideas.
Fair enough, and thanks for that. I want to shift gears. There are some questions that I can see in the chat. I'll come back to those in a minute. But since this is the Interplanetary Network Special Interest Group, I'd like to shift gears into looking towards the future. On the presumption that the Artemis mission is successful and that we are able to prepare ourselves for arrival at Mars, I can imagine that if we're successful at getting a multi-planet enterprise underway, so to speak, we're going to run into some interesting challenges. For example, frequency allocation, not stepping on each other, and looking at the interplanetary system design, which Scott Burleigh and I and others have worked on. You can imagine questions about, well, how do we manage the address space of the interplanetary network? How do we make sure we don't allocate the wrong, you know, the same thing to two different parties? How do we deal with the possibility that we have not only a common interplanetary network, but also, I won't call them private ones, but distinct autonomous systems, as we have in the internet today, where there are literally separate pieces of internet that are operated by particular parties, and they have rules for interacting with each other to do with routing and the sharing of resources and the like. I think we're at very early stage in the interplanetary design. Scott can speak to the concept of autonomous systems in the interplanetary network, but I just wonder whether any of these very, you know, long-term future issues are even on the horizon or on the radar for.
Sure. Well, I mean, I think it's, I guess, the 406 megahertz channel going to Mars that gets pretty crowded. And so with the DSN, I think that's right, but somebody can correct me. You know, we already see crowding and the need to plan, you know, today. So first thing is, of course, is there's interesting technologies familiar with optical comm and laser comm that are now looking at moving potentially into the commercial market. So doing laser comm backhaul in orbit and then doing it out toward the planets is one way of dealing with some of the frequency crowding problems. New technology with, you know, other partners. Europeans are very interested. We have U.S. entities that are very interested in that. The delay tolerant networking work that, you know, you and I, you've done so well on, and I've watched with admiration. as also pretty promising, and that seems to be the basis for most space operations. The trick part there is how to make sure that commercial and private companies are also able to get into it and participate in it. A lot of the work in the space frequency coordination groups today are very much driven by space agencies, and so sometimes the standards are driven by various national interests and champions. So the governance issue tends to come up in those standards bodies and what the right mix or what the fair mix should be of public versus private entities. And those, I mean, that problem has been worked through in the internet side for a long time. I think it needs to probably get worked through in the space side. One caution, I don't really have an answer for it, but it's something that I think some of my colleagues are worried about, is we continue to see the ITU wanting to get into internet governance, and I don't need to tell you all the stories around that. So we want to have multilateral engagement and agreement so that the system is beneficial for everyone. We're not exactly thrilled about giving over authority to some multilateral organization that either doesn't have the expertise or frankly we don't really fully trust. And the US, I think, has been pretty clear about that with the ITU. So there are things that the ITU does pretty well. The radio frequency coordination works well. The geosynchronous slot coordination, always a paperwork problem, but again, that works well. Internet governance, not so thrilled about. And so I think we would be, what we'd like to see is rather than a top-down solution, yet again, I think we'd like to see some bottom-up solution between governments and companies to come to voluntary standards that we could then seek multilateral adherence to, as opposed to trying to negotiate some treaty-driven thing top-down and impose it on people.
So let me make a distinction between the ITU and the Consultative Committee on Space Data Systems, which I think
quite different. Quite different.
And CCSDS, of course, has been the primary avenue through which standardization has been done on an international basis of the delay and disruption tolerant networking protocols. They've also been addressed in the Internet Engineering Task Force, partly out of an interest in the commercialization of the protocols and making them available to the private sector. So I would have thought, speaking now of CCSDS, are you equally concerned about that, or does that seem like a reason?
No. I'd like to see, there's an issue of how US firms and US people participating more broadly in standards activity. Now, CCDS is great. I'd like to see more involvement in it, no concerns to date about that. I think what we're seeing across the board, be blunt, has been China, stacking a variety of different, standards bodies, and within the ITU, within telecom, I suspect you're probably seeing the same participation. It's one thing to have kind of participation of their viewpoint, which is perfectly fine and fair. And it's another thing when you start finding bodies that seem to be dominated and driven pretty much by them and issues. So we need to be there. I don't mind the Chinese in space, welcome them. Don't mind the Chinese in working these communications issues and standards. I just don't want them to be there without us. We just need to be full participants.
So Scott, did you want to jump in? Scott Burleigh, you want to jump in on, I call you thing one and thing two.
Thing one and thing two. I was, a question that occurred to me as you're speaking was whether you're speaking about a bottom-up sort of approach to reaching some sort of governance. Would you consider something like the coordination that's being done for Artemis or that has been ongoing for the space station for a good many years as a model for that, or is something like CCSDS a better model for making that sort of happen?
I think something like CCSDS is probably a better model. What we're doing right now with Space Station is we're using the intergovernmental agreement and modifying it, stretching it to a breaking point, according to some of the lawyers. But we're using it to handle the lunar gateway. as kind of like having a free-flying platform loosely associated with station. But when you start going to the lunar surface, we're going to need new agreements. And the idea of a kind of a large, complex treaty-level agreement, we don't think will be really as flexible or as adaptable as we need it to be for the lunar surface. So we're looking first at agreements between space agencies, so for example, between ourselves and European Space Agency, NASA, and JAXA, agreements what we're going to be doing on the moon. But then an overarching political document would be like the Artemis Accords, which talk about adherence to various aspects of UN international agreements and how we will work with each other on the lunar surface. So sort of an operating protocol that we think would be much more sort of bottom up. So I don't envision a sort of master agreement or treaty for lunar operations the way we had with Space Station, which was a singular facility. Because I think we'll have multiple different types of facilities, multiple different types of operations on the lunar surface. And so a much more flexible agreement that covers our common political and diplomatic values, but then leaves it to agencies to cut deals with each other and arrange with each other. If there could be standards that emerge, like from something like CCSDS, I think that would absolutely be a great contribution. So, we encourage the work there.
So go ahead, Scott.
I was just going to bring out a couple of questions from the Q&A chat.
Okay, you go ahead.
That might be quite quick. First, there's one just clarification. Space Force is an independent service branch now rather than part of the Air Force, correct? And also, about how large is it? About how many folks are involved right now?
Sure. It is an independent branch, so it's within the Department of the Air Force. So just as the Marine Corps is within the Department of the Navy, the Space Force is an independent force within the Department of the Air Force. The size right now is actually, if you really ask it, General Jay Raymond, the Chief of Space Operations, is Space Force member #1. His Senior Enlisted Advisor is #2. They had 86 cadets commissioned into the force, so they're up to 88, and now we're in the personnel. So there's several thousand people out in the order of about 16,000 who are detailed to or assigned to the Space Force, but they're not in the Space Force. We're doing that conversion of folks right now to be formally in the Space Force. So that process is happening. We're looking at a target number of about 16 to 20,000 people. Whereas, in comparison, other military services are like, 186,000 people. So, I mean, it's definitely small, but over time, it'll grow probably to be the size of the Coast Guard, a little bit smaller than the Coast Guard. So on the order of tens of thousands of people. But right now, it's if you looked at it really formally, you'd see, say, 20,000 people working there, of which maybe a few hundred are formally commissioned in. But that number is changing and rising as we speak.
And that's very helpful. And two more questions that both have to do with regulation, with the regulatory environment for the space internet. One having to do with addressing the commercial sector's maybe misgivings about getting highly involved in solar system internet because of the risk from lack of regulation. Do you have any thoughts on that? And the other being any thoughts on regulations more specifically to applications that would run over the solar system internet, in particular healthcare and medical records kinds of applications, because that's going to be increasingly important as the human exploration program.
That's a terrific question. There is an intersection between privacy rights, and what the docs need, and the technical systems that can protect that privacy. I mean, on Earth, that's a gigantic problem. Generally, in space, we've treated people, astronauts are kind of a combination of patient and guinea pig. On one hand, you're using them as a test subject, and on the other hand, they're a patient subject to, doctor-patient confidentiality and all that. NASA has worked that balance out, I think, fairly well. In the Apollo program, the space docs and astronauts were not the best of friends. There was generally a kind of a hostile relationship, frankly, there between them. The shuttle program transitioned that, and the docs became really more partners. There was more of a respect for patient confidentiality and more of a sense of working with them. And so this balance of using you're a test subject as well as a patient has been one NASA's been able to work out, but that's been with government astronauts. How that evolves to having private sector people and their medical privacy while in space, boy, that's a new one. I mean, the issue of protecting, you want to protect confidentiality of all kinds of stuff going out there, but we'll probably be monitoring people pretty closely in space, one would hope. And so how do you protect that confidentiality for non-government persons? That's an interesting question. I don't have an answer to that.
We've thought some about encryption and data integrity in the design of the protocols for the delay-tolerant networking, but we don't have a lot of experience with it yet. So I'm sure there's still room to fabricate some regulations that would help out. That's not been done yet.
Well, one of the things I would suggest is that get to some best practices first before one goes to regulations. One of the more dangerous things is where people start writing regs where they don't really know what they're regulating. So anticipatory regulation is kind of one of the most terrifying things. It's much easier, as we did with orbital debris, where we had a series of practices, explosive bolt catchers, vent ullage in the tanks, the end of life, disposal orbits, that were developed as simply good practices within the relevant community, much before we put them down as UN guidelines or establish them into regulation. We really would like to be sort of bottom up first, because having the lawyers do it top down is generally frightening.
Well, this is ready, fire, aim, and it's definitely not the thing you want. I would argue, in the case of space medicine anyway, that the non-government astronauts might welcome continuous monitoring and the like, on the grounds that it will help them stay alive. And so we might imagine evolving policies that protect their not only their privacy, but also their safety and security from the health point of view. Yeah, but
I don't know. I'm imagining some pop star flying in space and having his renal function on a blog site. I mean,
that's not a good idea.
Probably not a good idea.
Not a good idea. I think it may be time to switch over to Dr. Cerf for your remarks, unless you've got a follow-up question you want to pursue first.
Well, actually, I have a bunch of questions, and I thought that what we ought to do with the remainder of our time is to engage in a discussion about issues arising that haven't been addressed yet by a fairly comprehensive review by Scott Pace, although I would argue that that review has been largely a near-Earth discussion, and I want to get into the deep space discussion as well. But before we get there, I'd like to also draw attention to a question that came up on one of the other chat channels, and that had to do with the question of, see if I can find it here. Yeah, this question was, what's the current state about nuclear weapons testing and usage in space? This is from David Terrazas, and I'm assuming, Scott Pace, that we still do not believe that nuclear weapons belong in space. But
that would be a violation of the 1967 Outer Space Treaty, to which we are a signatory, and so the answer is no. Doesn't matter who, but we think that's a bad idea. So no.
Yeah. So I'm glad to hear you say that. there's a let's move to the moon for just a moment and imagine for a second that we are successful in getting astronauts to the moon and to a place where they can be there for a period of time, laboratory facilities, but even a possibility of commercialization. What is the state of thinking for private ownership of anything on non-Earth space bodies?
Right. So this is something actually we have thought about. The executive order on space resources is something that addressed this. For those of you, those who are aficionados of international law, there's a thing called the 1979 Moon Agreement, which specifically banned sort of private ownership. The U.S. was never a signatory to that. A few other spacefaring nations were signatories, so it's largely a failed agreement. But we took the effort in the executive order to not only say we weren't going to be signing it, but that we thought it was not the basis of even customary international law. So really kind of a rejection of that approach. We are signatories to the 67 Outer Space Treaty, as I mentioned, and that rejects claims of sovereignty so you can't go out and claim ownership of, say, a plot of land on the moon and in situ resources. On the other hand, if you remove those resources, as we did, for example, in the case of the Apollo lunar rocks, we own those rocks. Those are U.S. government property. We've exchanged those rocks with the former Soviet Union. In return, we received samples from them, which was Soviet property. So the ownership of material removed from the moon is pretty straightforward. The ability to use lunar resources in beneficial ways, like extracting water ice and so forth, lunar oxygen, also is fairly straightforward, which is again claim sovereignty of the resources as they're there. What we're doing in the Artemis Accords is saying, look, for other people going to be working with us on the moon, like on the South Lunar Pole, we want to work out ways of non-interference with each other. Non-interference is another principle of international law. And so if we're working in a certain area, well, we don't want other people coming in and interfering with that. We also want to have agreements with other people that certain historical sites. We don't want the Apollo 11 or other Apollo landing sites disturbed. We don't own that land, so we can't enforce it as a sovereign. But we can come to agreements with other countries for mutual respect. So we will respect other countries' sites on the lunar surface. They respect ours. We work out. We're going to work in a certain area using lunar material. Other people can do that. We respect them. So working out those kind of reciprocal accords is a large part of what Artemis is going to be about, because we have this basic tenet of the Outer Space Treaty of not extending sovereign claims to space. I will note that sometimes the Chinese will talk about sites in space as similar to islands in the South China Sea that they have to go out and claim. Scarborough, what we call Scarborough Shoals, or whatever. Sometimes you'll have some writers, not official writers, but some writers will refer to, the moon as one kind of nearby island chain, and will refer to Mars as another part of the island chain that they need to go to and stake their claims on. I'll point out that it's a contravention of international law, just as their claims in the South China Sea are a contravention of international law, Convention on Law of the Sea. So how we operate together in the space environment is probably going to reflect behavior that we see here on Earth.
So there is an analogy that is worth considering, and that is the Antarctica agreements, where there is no sovereignty with regard to ownership of any portion of Antarctica. It's considered a global resource. On the other hand, each of the various stations is respected, as far as I can tell, with regard to its territory. And of course, there's a lot of interaction among the participants who are at those various national research stations. Does that form a model for other, like Moon and Mars and other parts of our solar system?
Yeah. So in the case of Antarctica, there is not a explicit rejection of sovereignty claims. what happens with that treaty is the agreements, the claims are put into abeyance. I'd make a joke about putting into deep freeze, but that would be cheap.
That is true.
And sorry, but you know, Argentina, Chile, other countries have claims, and the agreement is just not to pursue those claims for the period of the Antarctic Treaty being in place. So yes, it is a potential model, certainly for the moon, for Mars, other places one could imagine that. But again, the problem is enforcement mechanisms. I have to say, we do have problems, not well known, but do have problems with Chinese behavior in Antarctica. And in terms of lack of reciprocity, in terms of access, setting up industrial facilities that are not allowed, environmental constraints, you know, and so on and so forth. That's a whole nother sort of topic. So it's not it is certainly a potentially useful model. It's got some problems with it now, you know, due to behavior of at least one of the adherents. But that probably reflects a degree of maturation. I'd probably like to see more mature activity on the moon before you would then create an Antarctica-like model. But that's certainly one option that could emerge.
Well, let's pursue this a little bit further. One of the reasons that I'm curious about this is that we've seen an interesting transformation, which your administration has or the current administration has facilitated, and that's the movement of the private sector into space operations. And that's a good thing for a number of reasons, not the least of which is that the cost of operation is now borne not solely by the government. Although I have to say the trigger for a lot of the commercialization is in fact government contracts. But that's a facilitating step. On the presumption that space operations can become commercialized, then you can begin to imagine expanding that concept until you get to the point where mining, for example, for resources on the moon or maybe even subsequently Mars, would become attractive. Of course, there are all kinds of economic questions, but I would argue that the concept of private property doesn't necessarily have to be in total conflict with the sovereignty question. But I'd like to ask you to explore that a little bit, because at some point we won't see a commercial incentive for mining, for example, or even manufacturing and production operations on the moon,
Sure.
unless there's some private sector component to it.
Sure. So first of all, you know, we still own the property we put on the moon. There is no salvage rights. So for example, the debris we left on the moon from the Apollo sites is still our property, first of all. Secondly, property rights are not singular things. You can kind of think of them as a bundle of sticks. And each stick may have a different aspect, like the ability to use a particular site, the ability to sell an interest in the site, the ability to transfer a right. And, you know, so sovereignty problems that come with, say, a claim of ownership, you know, in fee simple on a site is really only one kind of a stick, the ability to have recourse to the courts. What Congress has said is that U.S. citizens have the same rights as the government. So a U.S. citizen can like own a lunar rock, for example, that he or she retrieved, you know, from the lunar surface. We'd like to see mutual recognition of those rights with other countries. So we can't unilaterally declare, you know, sort of ownership. We can come up with what our own laws will do. We can get other countries to recognize that. We can agree upon different bundles of property rights. And the more sticks you get in the bundle, the more economic, you know, benefit there is from that. Now this applies for our laws, it applies to those under our jurisdiction or control. Space is different than the oceans in that we are still responsible, we, the United States government, are still responsible for the activities of U.S. persons under our jurisdiction or control, as opposed to, say, the oceans, where if you go out on the ocean and become a pirate, the U.S. government is not liable. If you go out into space, we're still liable for your activities. So the scene in The Martian where Mark Watney becomes a space pirate is not really a thing. Can't really do that because he was always subject to the jurisdiction and control of the United States. But the again, different levels, the more property rights that can be recognized consistent with international law, and that's mutually recognized by other sovereign states, then the more economic benefit you're going to have. And ultimately, and here's an important philosophical point, international law is whatever sovereign states agree to. International law is not a separate thing that exists apart from sovereign states. It's a creation of sovereign states, either through direct agreement or through practice. And so if countries decide that they're willing to extend more private property rights or more sticks in the bundle, and still see themselves as compliant with the non-sovereignty claims, then that'll be it. But that's the dialogue that has to happen.
That's pretty fascinating. There's a long question that's coming from Yosuke Kaneko about the interplanetary internet, but looking at it from the perspective of the terrestrial one. He says, in the long term, I believe that the solar system internet is a resource for all humans on this planet and would enable exploration, science, innovation, commercial activities, and connecting everything together that compose our normal daily lives. That said, I would like to see the interplanetary network growing to become a global subject, going to become a global subject discussed amongst a variety of groups and people. In my opinion, this is Yosuke's opinion, a governance model for the solar system internet is required. But the question is, in what venue do we discuss the topic and how do we expand the network to get more stakeholders involved in it? Please share how you did this for the terrestrial internet. So
that's really the crux of the question. How did we do it for the internet, and how can we replicate that in the solar system internet?
And I think the part of the problem is that we don't have exactly the same set of rules of behavior in space as we have on this planet. But I think what Scott was saying has bearing on how this might evolve. To be honest with you, I don't think we should attempt to impose on the solar system internet some top-down set of regulatory structures. This is going back to Scott's earlier comment about the dangers of ready, fire, aim.
Yeah.
And I would argue instead that we should begin to get experience with the implementation and operation of the interplanetary network. We should particularly learn what it takes to cooperate with each other in order to make it work using components that are owned by multiple parties. And so in some sense, we are there a little bit because we work with ESA and JAXA and the Korean space agencies and others to test and try out and now use as we return to the moon in the Artemis program. So I would like to see cooperative efforts to, let's say, refine the implementation and operation of the interplanetary system initially. Now, what happened in the case of internet is that once it left the government-sponsored environment, and in our case in the US, there were 4 agencies that were deeply involved, but all of their networks were under the jurisdiction of each of the departments, the DOE and NASA, DARPA, and NSF. When the commercial sector started offering service in 1989, we had to introduce a set of rules and structures that would allow these independent entities to interwork with each other, but still have control over their respective pieces of the net. And I think that's exactly what we're going to have to do with the interplanetary system. Regardless of whether we have private sector use or not, I think there will be components of the interplanetary system that are the responsibility of different government agencies. And when it becomes commercialized, we just add those commercial elements to the same picture. So we'll have to have technical protocols that allow, interaction, routing, access control, and the like. And we'll have to have agreements about how we will protect information in the system. So Scott mentioned that we have security functional capabilities that are part of the architecture. Those will have to be introduced as well. My question, I think, for Scott Pace is whether we have to do something, a conscious development of procedures and regulatory frameworks, or whether this can happen in a more organic way. Is it in the internet?
A bottom-up sort of way that you start with individual islands of solar system internet, and they make agreements among themselves, and the aggregate of all those agreements becomes the regulatory environment.
Which is what has happened in the case of the internet. Just by way of observation, I'm still told that some 60 to 80% of all of the agreements among the internet autonomous systems are handshake agreements. There isn't even a whole lot of documentation. You just peer, you interconnect on whatever grounds you choose to do so. We have the border gateway protocol to deal with the routing question. There's work that's going on to secure the border gateway protocol against certain kinds of attacks that are known, vulnerabilities. But I noticed that Scott Pace was trying to respond to my question. So let me stop for a minute and ask whether there is a framework for evolving this, or whether Scott Burleigh's bottom-up model might at least last for a while.
Well, we're actually doing, we've kind of confronted this question, not so much through the internet side, but we are confronting this question in space right now. I mentioned orbital debris, first of all, which is the first area where there's kind of what was a bottom-up approach that then was recognized. So I worked on a thing called long-term sustainability of space activities, a series of 21 guidelines that we eventually adopted by consensus at the UN Committee on Peaceful Uses of Outer Space. This is the first time we had consensus guidelines adopted on sustainability, and they're pretty basic. I mean, there are things like, please clean up your mess, and if you're going to regulate a space sector, please talk to them first. I mean, they're very, very zero order sorts of things, but there's a recognition that we need to work together to preserve the space environment for space activities going forward in the future. Now, as we pushed along, putting different ideas out there, it was really clear that those ideas that made the most progress were ones where there was already a community of practice that you could refer to, because that was sort of a technical, non-political group you could point to as saying, well, this is the best practice, and we're just sort of now blessing it or adopting it or incorporating it in some way, maybe with some adjustments, but in generally working from something that was there. Because in multilateral negotiations, you do not want diplomats and lawyers, again, doing this kind of, you want them doing what they do best. You don't want them doing the technical input. You can't get technical design work, done in a UN environment, nor should you try. So where we hit a wall was when we tried to talk about satellite servicing. Now, a satellite servicing mission can look like a repair mission, or it can look like a hostile attack. Mm-hmm. So how do you tell the difference between, and what are the procedures you go to about getting permission and approaching, and what are the norms of behaviors that would identify something as a friendly mission versus an unfriendly movement? We've had problems, of course, most recently, Space Command has talked about the Russians launching what they call inspector satellites that emerge from a mother vehicle. That's a inspector moving at a pretty fast clip. Looks like a missile to me. So how we have these norms of behavior that have been developed over hundreds of years for the oceans and sea travel, past the left, versus what we do in space is still something that's emerging. We couldn't really make progress on satellite servicing because it was still too new. There wasn't a community of practice, and anything we said would be looked at through a political lens, that we were making normative judgments about what should happen as opposed to what does happen. So the satellite servicing discussion has moved back into the technical community that are working on those standards, developing that community of practice. They're making progress. So when they're ready, what we hope to do is we'll bring that back into the UN with multiple countries who have been involved in the process, and to hopefully adopt by consensus some very basic, simple guidelines for safe operations that people recognize as being non-political technical best practice. But it will be when the technical work is mature that we bring it into the UN process and not before.
So thank you for that. I noticed that we're going to run out of time shortly. There's another question that Ivan Kokic, I hope I got that right.
And actually, I thought that question was, I'd like to augment that question just a little bit, because I think it points to a broad issue that we really haven't maybe confronted. And which is what Ivan asks is, how do you regulate CubeSats? How about constellations of DTN nodes in different orbits? And to me, what this really points to is granularity of the networks that will make up the solar system internet. The barrier to entry to space has dropped quite a lot, because CubeSats are affordable by lots of countries that hadn't had space programs in the past, and private businesses. If everybody has access to space, and therefore everybody has access to solar system internet capability in space, what do we do about the fragmentation of the communication fabric? How do we negotiate agreements among all these potential tiny little networks that ideally ought to work better together? There's a scalability question there that goes beyond just the question of scalability of operating across a large number of nodes. It's a question of organizational scalability.
Oh, actually, there is an answer to this that you can derive from the BGP, the Border Gateway Protocol. Think for just a moment about any particular node which it has the capability to be part of the DTN. That means it knows what the bundle protocol is, it knows what contact graphs are, it knows presumably how to announce its presence. But its knowledge of anything else is a function of what anything else is willing to tell it. And so the idea here is that you don't just launch a CubeSat and start broadcasting. The CubeSat is going to have to be introduced to anything else that it's going to be allowed to communicate with by cooperation. That's what the BGP peering is about. You don't peer with somebody unless you want to exchange traffic with them. And so I think the way this works, honestly, is that you have to make an agreement with other parties if you are going to be able to communicate with them. There has to be some agreement about sharing of routing information or orbital information in order to be part of a communicating component. And if you're not, sorry?
Oh, so there may be, I think we're saying that there may be aggregations of organizations, and if you have a new subnet that wants to operate, you negotiate not with a million other subnets, but with an aggregation that already exists.
Yeah, well, roughly speaking, it's like peering. I mean, peering is about the willingness to share routing information with each other and to carry each other's traffic. That's the kind of thing I would expect to see in the DTN as well. We only have 3 minutes left. Scott, Pace, you ought to have a last shot at summarizing, if you wish, this session.
No, thanks. Yeah, I'm going to have to bounce. I think that the bottom-up approach in the CCDS has been very, I think, successful to date. I think a measure going forward is how to involve companies that are going to be wanting to provide services. We're pushing hard for NASA to incorporate, more commercial service providers in its network rather than, simply doing it all itself. Not just for TDRS, but for other things. And operating out of the moon, we'd like to shift to as much service buys as we can, and dealing with new technologies such as optical comm and laser, both for the moon and then out to Mars. We want to shape the international environment. We want to be a leader in it, and so we encourage U.S. entities to participate strongly in these standards bodies, because our only hope of something sensible, I think, emerging is through technical best practices that we can then later put a political cover on, but we don't want to do the political cover without the technical best practices being in place first. So let me thank everyone for your work, for your contribution, Scott, for your work out at the lab, and I appreciate being on today. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Scott Pace.
Thank you very much.
As we finish up, I want to note that Mike Snell has pointed out that there's lots still to discuss. There are just so many potential issues here. I think IPN-SIG would do everyone a big favor if we began a discussion internally within the special interest group about all the issues that we talked about, plus more that you'll see in the chat.
There's still plenty of questions to answer.
Lots of questions, and we should be exploring what will it look like as this system expands, as more parties become capable of running the interplanetary protocols and want to be able to share each other's resources. What problems will we have to solve, and what look like solutions for those problems? That should be a topic that the IPN-SIG pursues as a special interest group. So I would propose that to be our work statement for the rest of this year and probably next year and many years to follow.
I think that's an excellent summation of the discussion today. And we're just about out of time. So I believe we should probably sign off now. I think we've gotten most of the questions that are on the chat answered. Some remain to be answered on the IPN-SIG mailing list. And I hope we have an opportunity to have another conversation like this again in the future.
I certainly hope so. And I thank everybody for participating today and engaging. We look forward to those conversations to come. So everybody, keep your hands washed, wear your masks.
That's right.
And we will see you on the net.